Welcome to Bible Study 24, where sacred moments and eternal messages of faith are brought to life every day. Today, we invite you to witness a truly moving moment. Pope Francis' last public appearance bathed in the radiant light of Easter. This is not just a greeting, but a profound call for humanity to turn toward life, peace, and an unwavering hope. Let us listen closely to the powerful message of love, forgiveness, and resurrection that echoes from St. Peter's Square straight into the depths of our hearts. If you feel touched by these sacred words, don't forget to share this message, to spread the light of faith, and subscribe to Bible Study 24 to continue this spiritual journey with us. The ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica stood solemn under the soft embrace of the Easter morning sun. A gentle breeze stirred the banners adorning the square as thousands of faithful souls gathered, their eyes turned towards the Grand Loggia. The air was thick with anticipation, reverence, and a fragile hope, a yearning for a glimpse of the shepherd who had guided them through seasons of uncertainty. Suddenly, a quiet murmur swept across the crowd, growing steadily into a wave of hushed awe. Emerging slowly onto the loggia, leaning gently on his staff, came Pope Francis. Frail, yet steadfast. He carried within his humble presence a strength that no suffering could diminish. Behind him the cross was lifted high, the timeless symbol of sacrifice and redemption, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the square, reaching into every waiting heart. As he raised his hand in blessing, a profound stillness fell upon the multitude. For a moment, time itself seemed to stand still. In that silence, one could almost hear the heartbeat of a world aching for renewal, a world battered by conflict, wearied by division, yet still daring to hope. Dear brothers and sisters, his voice, though soft, resonated with a deep, unshakable certainty. Happy Easter. It was more than a greeting. It was an invocation, a declaration that even in a time marked by wars, sorrows, and countless unseen tears, the light of resurrection could never be extinguished. In that one simple phrase, he gathered the sorrows of nations, the cries of children, the prayers of the forgotten, and lifted them heavenward. Above the sea of pilgrims, the echoes of Alleluia began to rise tentatively at first, then swelling with a force that defied despair. From mouth to mouth, from heart to heart, the song traveled, a living river of faith that no darkness could dam. This was not merely a celebration of an ancient event. It was a living testimony that death had been swallowed up by life, that hatred would never have the final word, that hope, though bruised and battered, still stood triumphant at the heart of human history. As Pope Francis stood before the world, frail yet luminous, the message was unmistakably clear. We were made for life, not for death. We were created for love, not for fear. And through the victory of Christ, we are called to rise again and again until every tear is wiped away. The Pope's voice, though touched by the frailty of age, carried the weight of eternal truth. As the echoes of Alleluia faded into the soft murmur of prayer, he continued his words, weaving a tapestry of hope across the square and far beyond its marble embrace. Jesus, who was crucified, is not here. He has risen. The words fell like seeds into the fertile soil of longing hearts. They were not just an announcement. They were a proclamation that shattered the tombstones of despair. Christ had broken the chains of death, and with him, every sorrow, every injustice, every cry of the innocent had found its answer. The Pope paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him, young and old, rich and poor, the faithful and the searching alike. Each soul stood there carrying invisible burdens, losses they could not mend, wounds they had learned to live with, dreams deferred for so long that they had nearly forgotten how to hope. And yet here, under the great blue dome of heaven, the ancient truth was spoken anew. Love has triumphed over hatred, light has pierced the deepest darkness, forgiveness has conquered revenge. Evil, he said, has not disappeared. It still prowls the earth, seeping into homes and hearts, igniting wars and sharpening divisions. Yet it no longer reigns supreme. It no longer holds dominion over those who embrace the grace of this sacred day. In Christ's resurrection, evil has been unmasked, its final verdict already rendered by an empty tomb. To the weary and the broken, the Pope offered a solemn assurance. Your silent cries have not gone unheard. Your tears, though hidden from the eyes of the world, have been counted by God Himself. Not a single drop has been lost in the vastness of His mercy. In the passion and death of Jesus, He said, God took upon Himself all the evil of this world and through infinite mercy defeated it. These were not merely comforting words. They were a radical invitation, an urging for each listener to dare believe that their own brokenness could be gathered into a greater victory, that their own small lives could participate in the colossal drama of redemption. In the Lamb who was slain, yet lives, the Pope proclaimed pride that ancient poison of the human heart had been uprooted. Violence and corruption, though rampant, had been disarmed at the deepest level. Christ had risen not just to save humanity, but to remake it from within, to turn weeping into dancing and despair into a song of unyielding hope. As the morning light bathed St. Peter's Square, there was a sense that a new day had truly dawned, not just in the liturgical calendar, but in the very rhythm of the world's beating heart. For Christ is risen, and in His rising, the story of every soul could be rewritten, from darkness into light, from death into life everlasting. The Pope lingered for a moment, letting the weight of the resurrection's promise settle deep into the hearts before him. Then, with a tenderness that seemed to reach into each individual wound, he spoke directly to those who suffer, to the ones whose pain had become a silent companion, whose prayers had long seemed unanswered, sisters and brothers. He said gently, especially those of you who are experiencing pain and sorrow, know this. Your silent cry has been heard. Your tears have been counted. Not one of them has been lost. In a world where grief often feels invisible and suffering easily forgotten, these words rang out like a bell across the square, clear, undeniable, filled with the pulse of divine compassion. It was a reminder that no anguish, no hidden wound, no silent night of despair escapes the gaze of God. Every sigh, every broken dream, every whispered prayer, uttered in the shadows, had been gathered into His heart long before it found words on human lips. There was no platitude here, no attempt to erase the weight of sorrow. The Pope did not promise an end to suffering in this world. Instead, he revealed a deeper truth, that in Christ's own passion and death, God Himself had entered fully into human pain. He had not turned away from the agony of the cross. He had embraced it, carried it, redeemed it. In the battered, broken body of Jesus, every human agony had been absorbed, and in His resurrection, every wound had been given the possibility of transformation, not erased, but transfigured into something radiant, something that pointed toward life beyond loss. The Pope's words were not simply a consolation. They were a call to remember that in every suffering heart, a seed of resurrection had been planted, a seed watered by tears, nourished by faith, and destined one day to break forth into the unquenchable light of eternity. He looked out over the faithful faces streaked with tears, hands clasped in prayer, and blessed them, carrying each unspoken story in His own frail heart. The weight of the world's sorrow was heavy, but He bore it with the serene certainty that Easter had changed everything. No longer were tears signs of defeat. no longer was pain the final word. Because Christ had suffered first, the suffering of humanity had been forever woven into the fabric of divine victory. As sunlight continued to pour over St. Peter's Square, illuminating even the furthest corners, it seemed as if heaven itself was leaning closer, breathing hope into every wounded soul. And so to the broken-hearted, to the weary, to the forgotten Pope Francis offered not empty promises, but a truth deeper than any pain. You are seen, you are heard, and you are held now, and always in the arms of the risen Christ. As the echoes of compassion settled over the square, Pope Francis, with a renewed strength in his voice, turned to the heart of the Easter message, the invincible power of Christian hope. He spoke of a hope that was not mere wishful thinking or a fragile fantasy spun to ease restless minds. No Christian hope, he said, is rooted not in illusion, but in the solid reality of the empty tomb. It is a hope carved out of the hardest stone, forged in the fires of suffering, and crowned by the victory of life over death. Thanks to Christ crucified and risen, he declared, hope does not disappoint. It is a hope that dares to look into the darkness without flinching, a hope that stands firm, even when everything else crumbles. It is not an escape from the world's sorrows, but an answer to them, a defiant light that refuses to be extinguished. The Pope's words washed over the crowd like a tide lifting bowed heads and weary hearts. Hope, he said, is not an evasion. It is a challenge. It does not numb the soul. It empowers it. Those who place their fragile, trembling hands into the mighty hand of God are not abandoning reason. They are choosing to rise, to walk, and to build even when the world says it is impossible. In the company of the risen Lord, they become pilgrims of hope, witnesses not to a perfect world, but to a world where love has already won its most important battle. There was an urgency in the Pope's voice, a quiet but firm insistence. The resurrection demands a response. It calls each believer to live not as prisoners of fear, but as bearers of a new future, one crafted not by power or violence, but by the quiet revolution of love. This hope was not reserved for the strong or the pure. It was for all, especially for those who stumble, who doubt, who grieve. It was a hope wide enough to cradle the entire brokenness of humanity, and daring enough to proclaim that even death itself was not the end. Standing beneath the clear sky with the cross gleaming behind him and the songs of Alleluia carried on the wind, Pope Francis reminded the world of its truest identity. We are not orphans of despair. We are children of a living hope, heirs to a promise that no war, no sorrow, no grave can undo. And so Easter was not merely a memory of what once happened in Jerusalem. It was, and forever will be, the living heartbeat of a people who know that after every nightfall the dawn is certain. After every cross, an empty tomb waits to declare, love has the final word. With a quiet smile, the Pope raised his hand once more in blessing, as if sealing these truths upon every soul gathered before him and upon the watching world beyond. The Pope's words, carried by the spring breeze, now turned toward a deeper and more urgent plea, a call to recognize, defend, and cherish the sacredness of every human life. Easter, he said, is the celebration of life. God, who crafted each soul with infinite care, did not design humanity for death or destruction, but for life full, radiant, and eternal. Yet how often the Pope lamented the world forgets this truth. How often does it choose death over life, despair over hope, cruelty over compassion? He spoke with a quiet sorrow of the tragedies that scar the human family, the unborn child vulnerable in the mother's womb whose life is too easily discarded, the elderly and the sick who are increasingly viewed not as treasures of wisdom, but as burdens to be cast aside, the poor, the migrants, the marginalized whose very existence challenges the comfort of those who look away. The Pope's voice trembled with grief as he named these realities, but it also carried an unwavering firmness. Life, he reminded, the world is precious from the first breath to the last. No condition, no circumstance, no limitation can diminish the infinite worth that each soul possesses in the eyes of the Creator. And yet he said there is a great thirst for death that seeps into the structures of our societies, a thirst that manifests in wars and violence against women and children, in systems that dehumanize the stranger and silence the vulnerable. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before offering a profound challenge. We must hope anew. We must trust anew, even in those who are different from us, who come from distant lands, bringing unfamiliar customs, ways of life and ideas. All are children of God. All bear the divine imprint. And every act of care, every choice to honor another's dignity, becomes a small but mighty echo of the resurrection itself, a rebellion against the culture of death, a proclamation that life is still stronger. From the Holy Sepulchre, where Catholics and Orthodox celebrated Easter, together this year, the Pope prayed that the light of peace would radiate outward to the Holy Land, to every wounded nation, to every wounded heart. It was a vision of humanity not divided by walls, but bound together by the fragile, fierce gift of shared dignity. As his gaze swept across the crowds, a mosaic of languages, colors, and histories, Pope Francis's message was clear: to believe in the resurrection is to believe in the worth of every life. To walk in the light of Easter is to protect, defend, and lift up the dignity of every soul entrusted to our care. The Alleluias rose once more, not as an escape from the world's wounds, but as a promise that love, and only love, can heal what hatred has torn apart. From the heart of St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis lifted his eyes toward the suffering corners of the world. His voice, fragile yet resolute, became a bridge of prayer, reaching across borders beyond politics into the very wounds of humanity. He named them one by one, as if gathering each land and its people into his trembling hands, offering them to the mercy of the risen Christ. He spoke first of the Holy Land of Palestine and Israel, torn by endless cycles of fear and violence. His heart ached for the innocent, for the children who have known only the language of war, for the Christian communities clinging to faith amidst despair. He condemned the rise of anti-Semitism, the hatred that festers in hidden corners and open streets alike. Yet even as he named the darkness, he called forth a greater light, the light of peace, the possibility of reconciliation born anew from the tomb of Christ. From there, his prayer flowed outward to Gaza, where devastation reigns, to Lebanon and Syria, countries weary from conflict, longing for stability and dignity, to Yemen, where a forgotten war continues to crush lives beneath its brutal weight. The names continued a litany of suffering and a summons to compassion. Ukraine, still scarred by invasion, still crying out for justice. The South Caucasus, yearning for reconciliation after years of division. The Western Balkans, fragile but filled with hope for a future free from old hatreds. And Africa, vast, beautiful, bleeding. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes region, each bearing the heavy cross of violence, famine, displacement, each crying out in languages too ancient to be forgotten for the peace that Easter promises. The Pope's prayer was not naive. He knew the stubbornness of hatred, the complexity of political ambitions. Yet he insisted with the quiet authority of one who has gazed into the empty tomb that peace is still possible, that dialogue, forgiveness, and disarmament are not dreams for another age, but imperatives for this one. He urged the leaders of nations not to surrender to the cold logic of fear, the fear that builds walls, hoards weapons, and isolates hearts. Instead, he called them, and all of us, to embrace the true weapons of peace, compassion, justice, solidarity, mercy. There was a solemnity to his voice as he reminded the world that it is not targets that are struck in war, but people's souls, each bearing the image of God, each woven into the sacred fabric of creation. And so, with the soft light of Easter warming the square, Pope Francis entrusted the world's wounded places to the risen Christ, praying not just for a cessation of violence, but for a true resurrection of hearts, a peace born not merely of treaties, but of transformed lives. For where Christ is risen, no darkness is too deep. Where Christ is risen, no hatred is beyond healing. Where Christ is risen, even the most shattered lands can one day sing again. As the Pope's voice continued to weave a tapestry of prayer and hope across the world, he turned his attention to a deep and often overlooked truth: that peace is inseparable from freedom. The freedom to believe, to speak, to live, according to the dignity planted in every soul by the Creator. There can be no peace, he said solemnly, without freedom of religion, freedom of thought, and freedom of expression. It was a reminder as old as the prophets, yet more urgent than ever. In too many places, faith had become a reason for persecution rather than a cause for unity. Too many believers still knelt in secret, their prayers whispered behind closed doors, their sacred books hidden like contraband. The Pope's heart reached out to them, to the Christians, unable to freely profess their faith, to those imprisoned for their beliefs, to the forgotten martyrs of today's silent persecutions. But his call was not limited to one faith alone. True peace, he said, demands that every person, regardless of creed or conviction, be allowed to seek truth without fear, to worship or to question, to live with conscience unshackled. Freedom rightly lived becomes the soil where peace can take root. Yet the Pope saw another shadow, threatening that soil: the escalating race to rearmament. He spoke with sorrow of nations, pouring resources into weapons of death, while their children go hungry and their poor cry out for justice. The defense of one's people, he acknowledged, is a grave responsibility, but it must never become an excuse for stockpiling instruments of destruction, for building walls of suspicion, for fueling the fires of conflict rather than extinguishing them. The resurrection, he proclaimed, calls humanity to a different kind of strength, not the strength of armies and arsenals, but the strength of mercy, dialogue, and solidarity. We are called, he said, to break down the barriers that divide us, barriers that sow grave political and economic consequences, and to build instead the bonds that make peace possible. In a world that often glorifies power and mocks gentleness, this was a radical summons to lay down arms, to open hands instead of clenching fists, to invest not in death, but in life, in education, in healing, in justice, in the flourishing of the human spirit. The Pope's voice grew softer, but his words struck deeper. The weapons that build the future are not missiles or tanks. They are acts of kindness, seeds of forgiveness, bridges of understanding. As the Easter sun bathed the square in a golden light, it seemed almost as if the stones themselves were listening, straining to remember the ancient forgotten language of peace. For where Christ is risen, the call to disarm is not weakness, but wisdom. Where Christ is risen, the true strength of nations is measured not by their might, but by their mercy. The square fell into a reverent stillness, as Pope Francis, gathering the weight of all the world's wounds and all the world's hopes into his frail hands, lifted his heart in prayer for the future. He did not pray for a utopia. Free from struggle, he knew too well that human hearts are slow to change and that the journey to peace is long and paved with sacrifice. Instead, he prayed for a future shaped by a different spirit, a spirit born from the resurrection itself, where death no longer holds dominion and despair has no lasting home. He entrusted the fate of broken lands and broken hearts to Christ, whose tomb stands forever empty. He prayed for Myanmar, its people bruised by years of armed conflict, now also reeling from the devastation of a cruel earthquake. For the orphans, the elderly, the survivors, who sifted through the rubble not just of their homes, but of their hopes. He thanked the countless volunteers whose hands, rough with labor yet tender with love, had become living signs of Easter's promise. He prayed for those political leaders across the world, burdened with choices that ripple through generations. He urged them not to yield to the logic of fear, that ancient enemy of trust, but to summon the courage to choose life, to feed the hungry instead of fueling new wars, to heal divisions instead of deepening them, to build not monuments to power, but homes for the vulnerable. These are the weapons of peace. He said, his voice low but firm. Not tanks, not bombs, but acts of compassion, justice, and solidarity. The true architects of a future worth living in. He reminded the faithful and all who listen beyond the square that humanity's greatness is not measured by its conquests, but by its tenderness. Not by how much it can dominate, but by how much it can uplift. The Pope's words pierce the illusion that peace is won by the strong alone. Peace, he insisted, is the fruit of those who remember that every victim of war is not a statistic, but a soul, a child of God, with dreams and tears, with hopes that deserve to be honored. In this Jubilee year, he prayed that Easter might also bring liberation for prisoners of war, for political prisoners, for all those shackled by hatred, by injustice, by the chains of forgotten suffering. As his prayer rose into the clear morning sky, carried by the invisible hands of the faithful, the meaning of Easter grew even more luminous. A future of peace is not an impossible dream. It is a task, a mission entrusted to every heart that dares to believe that love is stronger than death. And so, under the bright banner of the resurrection, Pope Francis sent forth a blessing, not merely of words, but of a living hope breathed out into the waiting world. For Christ is risen, and because he lives so, too may hope never die, as the final echoes of prayer settled over St. Peter's Square. Pope Francis prepared to offer the Church's most solemn and far-reaching gift, the Urbi et Orbi, blessing to the city of Rome and to the entire world. Standing beneath the ancient columns, before the gathered multitude and the unseen millions watching from afar, he lifted his hand with a serene authority born not of earthly power, but of the risen Christ's triumph. Through the authority given to me by the Church, he proclaimed, I grant a plenary indulgence to all the faithful present here, and to all who are united with us by radio, television, and other means of communication. It was not a hollow ritual. It was a profound act of grace, a river of mercy flowing outward from that small balcony, washing over borders, languages, wounds, and regrets. In this singular moment, every heart, no matter how distant or broken, was invited to step into the healing current of God's forgiveness. In this singular moment, the weary and the burdened could feel the invisible yet tangible embrace of a love that makes all things new. The blessing itself felt like a great breath, a stirring of unseen wings, as though heaven leaned in, closer, to touch the faces upturned in hope. It was not just a prayer for absolution. It was a renewal of the covenant between the Creator and his beloved creation. Beneath the rising sun, the people bowed their heads, some weeping quietly, others simply standing in awed stillness, as the Pope, frail but radiant, entrusted them anew to the mercy that no war, no failure, no death could destroy. He prayed for the church that she might remain a beacon of unity and a vessel of peace in a fractured world. He prayed for all leaders that they might be guided by wisdom and compassion, and he prayed for every soul, seen and unseen, that they might find in the risen Christ the courage to hope again. The blessing completed, a great wave of joy rippled through the square. The faithful lifted their faces once more, their hearts lighter, their burdens shared now, with a grace beyond their understanding. But the moment was not yet finished. From the loggia, the crowds could see the Popemobile begin its slow, careful procession through the square. For the first time since his long hospitalization, Pope Francis, smiling warmly, waving with deliberate, gentle movements, rode among his people. He blessed the children lifted up to him, their tiny hands reaching out without fear. He blessed the elderly, the sick, the weary pilgrims who had traveled so far to see a glimpse of living hope. There was no mistaking it, though. His body bore the marks of frailty. His spirit carried the mark of resurrection. This was no mere ceremony. This was the living church gathered in faith and love, breathing again, the air of Easter, the air of life reborn. And so on, that radiant morning with banners, fluttering with alleluias, still humming in the air, the world was reminded once more, Christ is risen, hope is alive, and nothing, not even death, can silence the song of life. The Popemobile moved slowly through the sea of humanity, its steady path carving gentle currents through the gathered faithful. From every side, hands reached out not to grasp, but to bless, not to demand, but to receive. Pope Francis smiled softly as he passed, a smile etched with years of suffering, yet radiant with a joy the world could not extinguish. He was a man who had walked through the valley of weakness and pain and emerged not defeated, but refined, a living testament to the power of resurrection, not only beyond death, but within life itself. The morning sunlight danced off the marble columns of St. Peter's Basilica, bathing the entire square in a glow that seemed almost otherworldly. Flags from nations far and wide rippled in the breeze as songs of Alleluia continued to weave through the air like unseen garlands of hope. Babies were lifted toward the Pope, their tiny faces wide with wonder. The elderly wept openly, their lined faces shining with tears, both of sorrow and of inexplicable stubborn hope. Families huddled together, hands clasped tightly as if to anchor this sacred moment into the very fabric of their lives. It was not simply a gathering, it was a pilgrimage, a vast breathing testament that the human spirit, despite every trial and sorrow, still longs for grace, still hungers for light. And Pope Francis, fragile yet unbroken, blessed them all not from a distance but from within their midst, as one pilgrim among pilgrims, as one wounded heart among millions seeking the touch of the divine. Every turn of the Popemobile, every wave of his hand seemed to write invisible words across the square. Do not be afraid. The tomb is empty. Love has conquered death. As the procession drew near its end, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll, deep, resonant, ancient. Their peals rolled over the city, over the rivers and rooftops, over the unseen places where despair still tried to cling. And yet on this day, despair had no foothold. On this day, the square was a cradle of rebirth, a living echo of the first Easter morning when the stone was rolled away and the impossible became reality. The Pope, completing his slow journey through the people, looked up once more at the towering basilica. He crossed himself with deliberate reverence, his hand trembling slightly, his heart unwavering. Then with one final blessing, silent but potent, he entrusted the church, the world and all of humanity into the pierced yet triumphant hands of the risen Christ. The cameras slowly pulled back, capturing a square still shimmering with song, with prayer, with the unquenchable certainty that even now, even here, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And thus ended Pope Francis's last great public appearance, not as a farewell soaked in sorrow, but as a living alleluia, a whispered promise that life, real life, had only just begun. In a world often darkened by fear, division, and despair, the image of Pope Francis, frail, radiant, unwavering, reminds us that hope is not a fragile dream, but a living power stronger than death itself. Today we have witnessed more than a public appearance. We have witnessed a testament, a quiet, unstoppable alleluia echoing through every broken heart, every wounded land, every longing soul. Christ is risen. Hope is alive. And the light that dawned in an empty tomb over 2,000 years ago still burns in us through us and for the world yet to be reborn. Thank you for journeying with us through this sacred story. If you feel your spirit stirred, your hope renewed, we invite you to help us share this light even further. Don't forget to like this video, share it with those who need to hear that love is victorious, and subscribe to Bible Study 24 Hours, where every story brings us closer to the heart of faith. Until we meet again, may the peace of the risen Christ be with you always.